Awesome. Well, if you want to take notes during our message time, we do have your outline, your notes on the back of your worship bulletin for this morning. We're going to be in 2 Samuel chapter 5. If you want to get there in your Bibles or your Bible apps on your phones or iPads, you can do that. This morning, chapter 5, we're going to be starting at verse 1 here in a minute. I apologize this morning. I'm between allergies. They're kicking my butt, and my back. I may have to sit during this message. I hit 40 and something happened. I have no idea what, but it's been rough the past couple of days. So, and somebody tall was sitting in this chair because I can't even touch the ground. There we go. All right. So. This is our last week of looking at David. We've looked at the life of David all these past several weeks, and we've seen the ups and downs in David's life. And what we've been trying to do is we've been trying to connect the ups and downs and David's responses to our own lives, because let's face it, our own lives have ups and downs. We have twists and turns as well. So we've been kind of trying to bring that together over the past several weeks, and I hope you have seen your story in David's story over this past couple of weeks. Week 1, David was anointed king by the prophet Samuel at the age of 15. And the text for today, David is now 30 years old, and you may have keenly been aware that he is still not king yet. And he was anointed at age 15 to be the next king of Israel. Somebody asked the other day, is this boy ever going to be king? Are we going to get there? I said, we're going to get there, right? And they're like, why hasn't he been actually a king so far? I mean, we spent 5 weeks and he's still not king. Well, hopefully I'll answer the question as to why David hasn't been actually crowned king yet. Excuse me, today, okay? So let's take a look at our text, 2 Samuel chapter 5. I'm going to read verses 1 through 5 this morning. Then all the tribes of Israel went to David at Hebron and told him, "We are your own flesh and blood. In the past, when Saul was our king, you were the one who really led the forces of Israel." So already right there, the people of Israel know that David's been the real leader in all this, that King Saul, given all of the power and authority and influence that he's had as king, really hasn't done much as the king, that it's really been David that's been the driving force behind everything over this past 15 years since he was anointed king and defeated Goliath in that valley that day. It says, let's continue on here. And the Lord told you, you will be the shepherd of my people. You will be Israel's leader. So there at Hebron, King David made a covenant before the Lord with all of the elders of Israel, and they anointed him king of Israel. David was 30 years old when he began his reign, and he reigned for 40 years in all. So he was there for quite a long time. Longest reign, right? And also we know now that this will set in motion God's divine plan for the Messiah, for Jesus, because this now sets David up to be the ancestor that the Messiah is traced to, right? So I believe that perhaps the greatest measure of an individual's maturity is how one handles authority when they are given it, right? How we handle power, how we handle influence when we are put in a position of leadership, when we are put in the position of power, and we have influence over other people that have chosen to follow us. This message, if I had to give it a title, it would probably be, in modern day terms, it would be Uncle Ben from Spider-Man. With great power comes great responsibility, right? And it says so much about what you do and what I do in those moments when we have influence, when we have power, and what we do with that power and what we do with that authority and what we do with that influence when it's been given to us, right? A few things are more disturbing, I think you would agree. A few things are more disturbing than when you see somebody with power, when you see somebody with influence or authority, and they leverage it for their own benefit. And they totally neglect the people who are following them. Right? They use it to neglect the people they're responsible for. They neglect the people who have chosen by their own will, by their own merits, to actually follow that person. And they use that power and they turn it against the people who have chosen to follow them. And they use it for their own personal gain, for their own personal benefit. And it's all about them. And it has very little to do with the people who are following them. Right? But at the same time, I think you would also agree that there are a few things more amazing than a leader who has some sort of influence, who has some sort of power, who does something with it that actually benefits the people who are following them. Right? You see these stories all the time. These great leaders who do great things for the people who are following them. They use their power in good ways for the people that they are serving. Now, the last time, the last time we saw David, he was on the run because King Saul was out for his life. Okay, David was on the run for 8 years because King Saul saw David as a threat. Right, and if you remember, a couple of weeks ago, Jonathan, King Saul's son, is the one who comes to David and says, "You got to get out of here because Dad's about to get you." Right? He wants to kill you. Don't just get out of the city, get out of the country. And so David flees. And David has now been on the run for 8 years, hiding from King Saul. But at the same time, he's also been using his influence as he is out and about, doing good for people. That's why you heard in the lesson for today, we know that you have been a true leader of Israel. Right? It wasn't King Saul. We know it's been you the entire time. So David has been using this power and this influence that God has given him to do some good things out there while he has been on the run. And David's been learning some lessons as he's been out there on the run. One of the things that I think that David learns the most in terms of lessons is it's not about me. Right? It's not about me. Everybody say that. It's not about me. One more time. It's not about me. Right? David has learned that it is about God's will, it is about God's way, in God's time. Right? Let's all say that together. It's about God's will, God's way, and in God's time. If there's one thing you write down today, write down that. Right? It is about God's will, it is about God's way, and it is about God's time. All right? I believe that the reason that David wasn't king until today, after 15 years of being anointed, was that it was not God's timing yet. And David knew that. David knew that it was about what? God's will, God's way, God's time. Right? And that's why David hasn't been anointed king. If you read the story, we skipped a lot, actually, between the last time we saw him in Abigail and today when he's crowned actually king. David has had the opportunity to kill King Saul twice. All right? One time, we kind of heard glimpses of this last week. You know, King Saul's actually, he has to take a potty break at the cave where David is at. And David has the opportunity to sneak up on him. Right? But David doesn't do it. Right? So David has the opportunity to kill King Saul twice, and he doesn't. Because why? David knows God's will, God's way, God's time. Right? And the reason why David is still not king is David refused to replace what God had put in place. Right? David refused to replace what God had put in place. David refused to replace what God had put in place. And David knew that God had put King Saul as the first king in charge. And it wasn't his time yet. Even though David probably knew he would make a better king, King Saul was still in power. And David refused to replace what God had put in place. And why? God's will, God's way, God's time. Now, eventually, David and King Saul are, eventually, King Saul and Jonathan, we can't kill David yet. Actually, King Saul and Jonathan are killed. All right? They are killed in battle by, get this, the Philistines. Remember these guys? They're the ones who sent Goliath down, right? Everything comes full circle, I'm telling you guys. It just comes back. They are killed by the Philistines. And now finally, the two men that stood in David's way of being king are now gone. Because remember, if King Saul is king, Jonathan's the next in line for kingship according to human standards, right? But remember, God made a covenant with Israel that said, if you want a king so bad, it's going to be the ones that I choose, not who you choose, right? And so here's Jonathan, who would be the next in line, and he gets killed in battle as well. And so now this just opens the door up for David to actually become crowned king. An interesting part, I think, if you read the story of David right before this, is that when David hears that King Saul and Jonathan have been killed, it says that David actually mourns their death. Can you imagine that? The dude that is after you to kill you is killed. He's the only thing standing in your way of being king. You know this. And David feels bad that he's died. That's pretty powerful. That's pretty impressive. Right? So, we then get to today's text. Excuse me. And David is finally crowned king. Finally. Why? God's will, God's way, God's time. Right? And David is able to move into this position. Now think about it if David had actually killed King Saul, right? What if David would not have done it God's way? What if David had not followed God's will and done it in David's time and killed King Saul? I don't think he would have been able to do what he would have done over the next 40 years as he's crowned king. Because if you kill the king, there's got to be some friction that's going to happen. I have no doubt that there were people out there who liked King Saul as a king, right? But this way, in order for David to fully embrace becoming king and being who he is, he followed God's will, he followed God's way, and he followed God's timing. All right? So David is finally crowned king. And now the question is, what kind of king are you going to be, David? What do you do when you're king? What do you do now that you have the power, now that you have the influence, now that you have the authority of this entire nation? What do you do with that power? I think we fast forward several hundred years to the time of Jesus to find that out. And we go to a little upper room on a dark night where Jesus sits with his disciples one last time. And as he's sitting in that meal, they're celebrating the Passover meal. And in that room is Jesus and his disciples. And Jesus has the power, Jesus has the authority, Jesus has the influence, and Jesus has been called king. Right? And Jesus now models what we should do when we have the authority, power, and influence in our lives. In that meal, Jesus gets up. He goes over to a table. He gets up and he has this bowl and he has this pitcher of water. He ties a towel around his waist and he tells his disciples, I'm going to wash your feet. And the disciples know Jesus has the power, the authority, and the influence. And they're like, absolutely not, man. We should be washing your feet. Servants wash the master's feet. Servants wash the king's feet, not vice versa. And Jesus says, look, unless I wash your feet, you're not going to be clean. And Peter's the one who's protesting the most. He said, no, absolutely not. And then if you have to actually wash my feet, wash my whole body. And Jesus says, no. First of all, I ain't got enough water. He's only got a pitcher. No, he says, look, unless I wash, you can wash the entire body, but if you don't wash the feet, you're not entirely clean. Why? But remember, they wore sandals at the time, right? Yeah, you can wash the whole body, but if you don't ever wash your feet, you're not entirely clean. And so Jesus does this. And remember, he washes every disciple's feet, even Judas, who he knows is about to betray him in that meal. Every one of them. It reminds me of David, right? Not taking action, not killing Saul, right? So Jesus is sitting here, and he washes even Judas Iscariot's feet. When he's done, he takes off the towel, he puts it away, he puts the bowl and the pitcher up, and he looks at his disciples. He says, now that I have washed your feet, I want you to go out and I want you to wash others' feet. Jesus now hands authority. He hands power. He hands influence over to his disciples by saying, you have seen me do this. Now I want you to go out and do the same thing. Basically, Jesus tells his disciples in those moments when you have power, when you have influence, I want you to go out and I want you to look for more feet to wash. Again, going back to my first statement, the greatest reflection of our maturity, the thing that says the more about our maturity than anything else, is what we do when we have the power and when we have influence in our lives. With great power comes great responsibility. And this is what is called, brothers and sisters, as servant leadership. And I look out there and I look at leaders in the world today, and I don't see servant leadership. Because servant leadership says it's not about me. It's not about me. It's not about me. And the greatest thing I think we're lacking in the world today is leaders who are servants and who use the power and authority and the influence that they have been given to do good and to benefit the world and for the people who have chosen to follow them. And here's the thing, church. Here's the thing, church. We have power and influence because Jesus has given it to us. If we say that we are Jesus' disciples and Jesus has given his disciples the power and the authority in this world, we have power and influence and authority. And Jesus is looking to us to model what he modeled in servant leadership. And servant leadership says it's not about us. It's not about us. It's not about us. Say that with me. It's not about us. It's not about us. It's not about us. This is where our story intersects David's stories, right? God's will, God's way, God's time. During the time that David was running, during that 15 years between when he is anointed and when he actually gets crowned king of Israel, I believe he learned two valuable lessons. All right, we've already heard the first one. What is it? God's will, God's way, God's time. He learned that what Peter Parker had to learn when he became Spider-Man, right? With great power comes great responsibility. And I believe that he learned this, that leadership should always be looked at through the lens of stewardship. Because it is a great responsibility that we have been given. And we should be good stewards of what God has given us. Leadership is always stewardship. You see, David, this is the thing that we always overlook. David never saw himself as the king. David always saw himself as simply a king. And there's a big difference. With all the ups and downs, with all of his flaws, he never confused himself with the king of Israel. He always saw himself as a king of God. And he went out and showed servant leadership. David learned it, Jesus modeled it. Now imagine if all of us with influence in the church led this way. Imagine if all of us went out into the world and all of our leaders and all of us led our lives in this way and saw our leadership as stewardship. That we saw our power and our influence and our authority because we have it and used it in servant leadership. Imagine what the world could be. History tells us that that kind of selflessness changed the world once. And I believe it has the power to change it again if God's people would follow David's example. In Jesus' name, amen.